Hi, this is Paul. Some of you wanted me to talk about the Jordan Peterson response video by Alex O'Connor. Truth be told, I cannot make it through this video. The reason I can't make it through this video is because the assumptions he has about the history and how the Bible is used and all of those things just are ridiculous. And so I hear him talk and it's like, don't even bother. Now, that isn't to say that a whole bunch of people don't share the assumptions that he has about the Bible, Christians and non-Christians. And this gets into the very long project of mine to try to come to terms with what on earth we mean by these massive things, hyper objects we call religions like Christianity or Judaism or Islam, and these massive things when, as you can see with any new atheist response, what practical good are these massive things? If the Bible doesn't give you basic instructions before leaving Earth, what good is it? You might as well throw it away and become a new atheist or just say everything is constructed, yada, yada, yada. So I'm always trying to get at it's sort of an inverse epigenetics. So genetics are this code that you can take any cell of my body and discern the genetic code, and there are 4 letters that sort of embody or map this genetic code. And you can, if you get that down to a certain point, maybe at some point, I don't know, I'm not a geneticist, but I have a unique genetic code. I have a unique genetic fingerprint. There is no identical PVK twin. There is nobody else like me. But then there's this level of epigenetics where these epigenetics sort of turn things on or off, and they notice that these epigenetics don't quite work like genetics. And then, of course, if you listen to Michael Levin, you've got this whole sort of electrical system that goes on with the cells, and we're just enormously complex. And so a lot of what I'm always trying to get at is the epigenetics that is sort of turning things on and off with respect to the Bible. And one of the things that we've been talking about lately is this post-war consensus. And Rusty Reno's book, which I've been reading, is all about the development of this post-war consensus. And although he wrote the book in 2019, as he says, it sort of got covered up by COVID. But now he's making the rounds 6 years later. It's sort of the world's most delayed book tour. I'm sure it's not the world's most delayed book tour, but in terms of modern publishing, it's a very delayed book tour. And he's been, there's just a lot of conversations with him over the years. And now Andrew Klavan has finished the book and he's come in for a conversation. Now, part of what's nice about listening to authors on their book tour, especially a book tour like this where he wrote the book years ago, but he's been talking about this book for a long time, and his thought has been able to mature. And so when you listen to a book tour-ish conversation like this one, you're going to get from Reno continued distillation and crystallization of his thought. And so while I'm reading the book and while I've listened to some of these, some elements of this caught my attention, and I'm going to connect them with the Christian Reformed Church. Now, this is my last video of this kind for probably a couple of weeks. So those of you who are used to my videos coming out every day, you're going to have some withdrawal. Now, it's not a lot of you, but there are some of you, so I hope that the corner manages to step up and you'll have to watch more Grail Country and Grim Grizz and Kale Zeldin, and maybe we'll get some new ships add to the flotilla, and we'll get some new channels out there that you can live stream on, etc., etc. If you really want to see me, you might catch me on the Synod floor once CRC Synod starts streaming on YouTube. That's up to you. I think they have the comments turned off now. But let's jump into this and listen to some of this.
So let's talk about this. I mean, I thought one of the most interesting, and it was kind of obvious after you said it, was that where we are is historically based. I mean, a lot of the things that some people are now talking about as if they were eternal truths are actually truths that are linked into a moment in history. Can you explain to people what the thesis of the book is so everyone knows what we're talking about?
It's a straightforward thesis about the 20th century that the 20th century is has two basic movements. They all revolve around the catastrophe of 1914 to 1945. The senseless bloodshed on the Western Front, and then the political upheavals, more pronounced in Europe than they were in the United States, but maybe culminating with the Spanish Civil War. And many people really believed that the future was going to be either communism or fascism. And then 1939, the beginning of World War II, culminating in two nuclear weapons dropped on Japanese cities and the revelations of the scope of genocide in the death camp.
Now, if you remember my conversation, a lot of this began with Jonathan Peugeot and the observations he made in my last conversation with him and Vervaeke. And for those of you who've never seen that, or those of you who need refreshing, and even if you don't feel like you need refreshing, I'm going to drop them in now.
I think first of all, I totally agree with you, Paul. I think that, if we look at the sacred events, let's say, or the sacred moments and sacred spaces that have created our time now, I think of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and I think of the Holocaust. Like, those are things that I think of in the sense that they are massive human sacrifices that have founded the modern, like, let's say, post-World War II state. And the entire world order is based on those events. All our narrative, everything we say, is all based on those events. We still, even today, like, even Trump being elected is deeply ingrained in these sacred, let's say, stories. And so I completely agree. And that's why I present it as a kind of gray thing, like, that the idea that the sacred is returning. It's both, it's like George Floyd was a little eruption of the sacred. It's like, here's a fast where everybody is locked into their house, a human sacrifice, and then an ecstatic explosion. It's like, oh yeah, yeah, not sure we want that. But the thing is that, in some ways, one of the things that is happening is that we're also exhausting the story. It's let's say, and it happens just naturally through time, with people dying and generations moving away, and some aspects of the story that were also taboo people are trying to talk about it in different ways. And so this is demythologization of the stories is also going to happen, of that sacred origin. And so we can see attempts at that now. We can kind of see it happening. We can see this poke. And so it's calling for another foundation. And so I agree that there's an aspect of it that is absolutely terrifying. But the problem is that it's going to these things are going to happen. Like, there's no like, for example, like, this weird desire for World War III, like this weird, like, longing and dreaming of nuclear war at this moment, with a mix of fascination and terror that we can see in the eyes of people that keep talking about it. It's like, that's a longing for the sacred too. It's a longing for something that will just set things right. Like, it will make everything clear again, because now everything is muddy and nobody knows where they are and nobody knows what to think and nobody knows. It's like a good war, let's just put everything in place. And so these are all things that are happening, and they're all things that are very frightening. And that's why I keep harping on the fact that I think the way that Jordan presents it, is deeply a Christian way of thinking of it. It's like the cross replaced this with self-sacrifice. It is the sacred, like, it is both the ultimate sacred and the disarming of the sacred, right? In the way that René Girard talks about it, but then also, I think, in a way that Girard misses, because it is still anyways, there's something else going on in Jesus's cross that is not just a disarming of the sacred. It's a refounding of it in a way, in a deep way. So I think that it's weird, like the only solution to avoiding a sacred event in the big sense is to enact it personally in a small way, almost like a kind of diffusion mechanism, like where we enact the best aspects of the sacred in our lives and our families and our communities, and that can prevent the need for a new sacred foundation, which will be bloody. Like there's almost no other way for it to happen. Like, so I mean, you could imagine something. I mean, it could be something else. Maybe that's why Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, because he's looking for a sacred event. He's looking for something to refound us, something to give us a new direction, a new purpose. Maybe that's all these things are kind of bubbling up at the same time. But I agree with Paul that we cannot forget the what the sacred is and how it manifests itself.
Okay, on with this.
Camps in Europe. So I think those really, it knocked the stuffing out of Western civilization, those events. And the victors of World War II, especially Americans, really put their minds to trying to understand what went wrong and how we can prevent it. And so the second half of the 20th century is dominated by the never again imperative. And this leads to what I call the post-war consensus, or...
Okay, that never again imperative is so interesting because buzzwords are holy words. And if you go to any Holocaust memorial, never again. If you look at, I remember when I was in college, my father and I went to an anti-nuke protest in New York City. See, I get my radical liberalism honestly from my father. And we went to this no nukes because I wanted to go. And my father's like, yeah, I'll go with you. So we both go to New York City. And if you, I don't remember what year it was, but if you do a little bit of research, you can find there's this massive anti-nuke protest in New York City. And you won't find my picture in any magazine because there's like 1 million people there saying, we've got to do something about nuclear weapons and the Cold War, et cetera, et cetera.
The open society consensus. It's a notion that we need to really drive out the passions and the fervor that gave rise. This is how...
Now this is his thesis of the book, and it's a fair thesis, but I'm not sure. There's some interesting ironies here because, of course, it's sort of a communal coming to terms with the passion. And what's something that's interesting with this sort of ortho moment that we're seeing now with all this new interest in orthodoxy, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the video, is if you listen to the Orthodox, one of the things that, like the church fathers, they will emphasize is, well, you join the Orthodox Church and you do the liturgy and you submit to the priest because you have to come to terms with your passions, and those passions need to be subdued. And that's straight out of the Bible. No Protestant should complain about that. But what's interesting is that in many ways the Orthodox moment is a reaction to the post-war consensus in some ways. And the post-war consensus is also, to a degree, about we as a society no longer permitting certain passions. But this is the funny thing with passions, is that usually when you suppress some, others come out. I remember a friend of mine, he was one of the first people that I knew as an adult who was really into AA, and he had been sober for years, but he had a love of food, and he collected cameras. And when he died, his widow found a box full of screwdrivers. I don't mean vodka and orange juice. I mean physical screwdrivers, which baffled her because he wasn't a particular handy guy. And so she was like, what's going, and he left about 15,000 records and CDs and cassette tapes because he had been a buyer for a major record outfit for classical and opera, and he left his poor widow with all that. And she had hoped that she could be able to turn that hoard into money, but the point is that he had sort of an addictive personality, and once he was free of alcohol, the passions are really funny things. You sort of subdue them in one area and they sort of pop out in another. And I think when people look at what's happened with the post-war consensus, certain kinds of passions were now impermissible, but certain other kinds of passions, they were not only laudable. And one of the things that I think about often is this dynamic between rigor and liberation. And so we were rigorous about certain kinds of passions and liberationist about other passions. And these have sort of worked themselves out as this consensus just went on and on and on.
The analysis goes that the ideological passions need to be cooled. And to do that, we need to put our civilization on a much more modest footing. Technocratic reason, liberty and rights become super important to protect the dignity of the human person.
Now, a couple of days ago, Algo, I say this and people often think Algo is the YouTube algorithm. YouTube algorithm served up for me a really fine video by Damian Walter called Star Trek is Propaganda. And it really fit in well with this whole post-war consensus because
there's something wrong with this map, and this map, and these maps. Fans have made many maps charting with nerd-level accuracy the known universe of Star Trek. True nerds will point out that space has 3 dimensions, but given that our galaxy is 100 times wider than deep, it's not unreasonable to map its galactic empires on the galactic plane, because these are the territories and borders between the Klingons, Romulans, Cardassians, galactic empires. Or worse.
We are the Borg. Resistance is futile.
The exception is the United Federation of Planets, which, as the name suggests, is not an empire, but a federation. Which is the problem with these maps. If Earth is a relative newcomer among warp-capable civilizations, how is it the center of the Federation? And if the Federation has territories and a Starfleet, is it really not just another empire? The answer is that Star Trek isn't really about the future, and these maps aren't of the galaxy. Star Trek is about the culture that made it, and these maps are maps of its geopolitics, the United States of America. Because Star Trek is propaganda.
We, the people of the United States.
Excuse me? Star Trek liberal propaganda? Are we even watching the same show?
Can we please stop pretending Star Trek isn't a flawless blueprint for fully automated luxury gay space communism?
Okay, sure. Star Trek has a message.
You're probably one of those people who thinks the Prime Directive is woke because it tells white guys not to colonize people with forehead ridges.
The Federation is literally a post-scarcity socialist collective where healthcare is a right and replicators dismantle cis-heteropatriarchy daily. If you don't see that, you're either a class traitor or a Ferengi.
A critique, a cap.
Allegory.
How to what? Whether you work in propaganda, be able to propagandize a whole nation. I propagandize for what I believe in. Propaganda. What I believe art is comments. Whether you work in marble and stone or painting on a canvas or music or what.
You get the idea. So it's a great video. Now, Damon, of course, has his own opinions on all of this, which will come through in the video. But the point that he makes is that, yeah, we have a culture. And again, as I said before, just like when, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was like, it was the big joke that white people have no culture. Well, white people can't see their culture because white people was sort of the dominant culture of the culture, that nobody can sort of see their own religion very clearly because their religion is so close to them. Our culture is so close to us. My religion is so close to me. Religions are the basic operating system of the world to determine that which is highest and how to achieve it. That's what religions are. So we've got this post-war consensus going, and it's coming to an end.
And that this project, this post-war consensus, I'm sure I would have supported it in 1950. And to be honest with you, I went to college in 1979, and I was educated in it, and I thought it was common sense. And it's really only really after the end of the Cold War when, paradoxically, it ought to have relaxed its grip. It actually went into overdrive. And this consensus has been turned into a kind of all-out assault on any kind of permanent anchor in society, or, as I put it differently in other places, it's been an assault on love, because love is an anchoring impulse of the human heart. The things you love, you cling to. The things you love, you defend. And this kind of galvanizing of the soul is seen as a potential threat to society, the open society.
So basically, if you love your country, if you love your God, you're immediately Hitler. I mean, it's amazing how quickly people leap to calling each other Hitler.
Yes, it's also interesting that this is, if you look at Renaud Camus, French intellectual, has a wonderful essay called The Second Career of Hitler. and we published an article called The End of the Age of Hitler by Alec O'Reilly, who's an English historian. And he notes that Hitler doesn't really come into our vocabulary as the image of absolute evil until the 1960s. In the immediate aftermath of the war, there was, I think, a more balanced approach, and also there was a desire to get on with life, and there was a certain impulse to forget. And so really it takes on this stronger element. In fact, one of the theses of the book is that the baby boomer radicals in the 1960s, late 1960s, were not rebelling against their parents' values. They were rebelling against what they thought were their parents' hypocrisy, because the open
Now, this is key.
society consensus became the dominant consensus in the 50s, but we still had this many, strong institutions and middle-class consensus, and it was, they wanted to perfect it and extend it. And that's been the project of my lifetime. I mean, my entire adult life has been lived under the kind of accelerating power of the open society consensus.
Okay. So I'm a digger, so I dug up one of these articles. I'll put the link below. It's here in First Things, The End of the Age of Hitler. And I read this piece, and every now and then you have the impact of reading a piece, and it's like, oh, of course. Oh, my. Oh, this lights up all kinds of things. A century ago, the most potent moral figure in the West was Jesus Christ. Believers and unbelievers alike accepted him as an ethical exemplar. Now it's interesting, part of when I was watching Alex O'Connor, many new atheists, they'll attack the Mosaic Code, they'll attack the Apostle Paul, but they tiptoe around Jesus many times. Now, they might be skeptical. I had to see who was calling me. I don't know who's calling me. They're not in my book. They might be skeptical about his divinity, and they might be skeptical about his resurrection, but they very seldom take on his teaching, which is really rather remarkable because, truth be told, something like the Sermon on the Mount, I've used that that Texas A&M piece that was in Reform Journal years ago, where a frequent contributor to the Reform Journal, she taught English at Texas A&M. She gave a plain copy of the Sermon on the Mount to her teachers. This is her students. This was in the 1980s, and this is the heart of the Bible Belt during, the baby boom, and most of the students couldn't stand the Sermon on the Mount. They thought it was ridiculous, which is just a really amazing piece. I've treated it in past videos. Not only so, not to do so was to make oneself an outcast. But now, our most important moral figure is Adolf Hitler. In our relativist, pluralist age, he is one reference point by which we know what is evil. Now, it's been interesting how the Hitler, Churchill, World War II, we got to get the record straight on World War II, how Tom Holland's brother has been on trigonometry, and then he was on Lex. It's like, okay, we have to consult the Holy Liturgy about the Second World War and keep that memory alive, because what's very interesting for those who want to, let's say, change the religion of the West, they immediately go after World War II history, which is an amazingly well-documented history. Now, history always has historiography, always has interpretation, but a lot of the claims that are made by some people in order to sort of jigger with the current religion are just absolutely ludicrous. I mean, just read Mein Kampf and you'll get a sense of what the man cared about, okay? So it's well documented history. But yet people want to revise it because they understand that not Christianity, not Islam, not Judaism, not Hinduism, not Buddhism, but the active epigenetic religion of today is built on the sacred stories of the Second World War. We still believe that Jesus is good, but not with the fervor and conviction with which we believe that Nazism is evil. And this is where I sort of see Reno's point about the passions as a little bit weak, because, what we've seen over the last 10, 15 years is that people passionately try to defend this religious layer of the post-war consensus. They do so with great fervor. They do it in the church. They do it out of the church. And I would say one way to understand the rise of new atheism. So my friend Dr. Jim, the cardiologist, he's been writing on Substack, by the way, and I've been, I just read one of his pieces and I'm really meditating on it because it really helps me understand. But one of the points that Dr. Jim made, and he's a really sharp guy, was, part of it, you usually see sort of the flourishing, or at least a certain thing getting loud right before it sort of knows its existence is in danger. And so his understanding of new atheism is they kind of came to the fore as sort of their last gasp. And a far more religious age is upon us. And that's sort of in alignment with Reno's thesis too, that the strong gods are returning, and so we're going back to another lion age. And no, don't get me wrong, I like fox ages. I'm pretty much a fox myself. But if foxes don't recognize lions, foxes become dead foxes, because lions and foxes. All right. Crosses and crucifixes have lost most of their cultural power. They can be played with, even joked about, and no one really minds. The swastika packs a far greater punch. Play or joke with that, and you've made yourself a monster. Remember, buzzwords are holy words, and also prohibited words are holy words. And, you see this with school-age children all the time. Once they figure out what the words of power really are, they're going to use them. I use the illustration of somebody had written a racial epithet over a water fountain in a Sacramento grade school. And, school district was falling all over itself because, see, the institutional racism is here, and white supremacy is just around the corner. And And then when they finally found out who did it, it was an African American girl. And you say, well, why would she write a racist against African American epithet over a drinking fountain? And it's like, have you ever seen kids try to get attention? They're not dumb, you know. And if you give them dynamite and they want attention, they're going to blow it up. And what you have to figure out is, well, how are you going to handle this? Because if all you are is reactive, you're pretty much playing their game. There's some incidences right now that whole dynamic is germane to. To understand the post-war age, we need to realize this. It is the age of Hitler. Since 1945, the man with the toothbrush mustache has dominated our moral imaginations. I don't object to demonizing him, but we should be clear about what we've done. We have replaced a positive exemplar with a negative one. We've taught ourselves that evil looks like a Nuremberg rally, when in fact evil takes many forms. And we've persuaded ourselves that we live in an age that has no religion, when in fact we are believers in the myth of World War II. So I'm pleased that the wheels are coming off that myth, that we are losing faith in the age of Hitler. I think there's a good chance that something better will come next. He's optimistic. There's reason for concern. Western culture didn't switch out a Christian moral system for an anti-Nazi one without good reason. Christianity's moral authority had been decaying for centuries. But what made the decline terminal was World War II. Now, again, when I was in Italy, one of the books that I read was The Pope and Mussolini about Pius XI, and then the sequel to that book on Pius XII. And it was shocking. I wanted to read something about Mussolini, and this popped up, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and I thought, this is interesting. So I read it and was like, holy cow. I'm learning a ton about the Roman Catholic Church, because when I was in Italy, it was like, I'd always heard, okay, Italian unification was late, but what was before there? And I had visited Naples and Pompeii, and then I'd visited Rome, and then I'd visited Florence, and then I'd visited Milan, and then I'd visited Venice, and so I'm getting a sense of what what Italy was, and then reading some history on the Italian unification and the end of the Papal States, and then finally the conquest of Rome by the Italian armies, and the Pope is the prisoner of the Vatican, and then you read a book like that, it's like, oh. Now again, this is holy stuff. And I remember when I first started talking about this book on the channel, people were like, some Catholics got a little defensive. But it's a well-documented book. It's a very interesting book. And it's very interesting on so many levels. For example, I learned, suddenly I started digging into more papal history, and I hear things like the Syllabus of Errors and Vatican I. And then I read how, then you understand sort of the rise of fascism. And, fascism is in many ways sort of a modern reappropriation of ancient imperial modes of government. We're going to have a strongman leader, and religion and society are going to be in lockstep. That's very different from the American model, where you have the separation of church and state. It's very different from the communist model, where you have the attempt to squash and take apart the church. Fascism is a religion that sort of goes with is a form of government that sort of goes with religion. And so at least in Spain and Italy, there was an attempt to sort of fuse fascism and Catholicism. Now, that didn't go very well in Germany. Hitler, of course, is Austrian, and Austria is, of course, part of the seats of the great Habsburg empires, which, of course, was linked with Spain. The Habsburgs sort of split their empire between the Spanish and the Austrians. And so, I've been reading this book written by a Habsburg about the history of the Habsburgs, and it's been very interesting. So, Pope Pius XI maybe had hoped that, Pius didn't like Mussolini and Mussolini didn't like them, but they had sort of a marriage of convenience. They both sort of looked across the aisle, and Mussolini would say, I'll let you teach morality in the schools again. I'll sort of suppress certain movies and plays that you find morally offensive. And in exchange for that, I want you to back me. And then we'll sign a concordat. And I've been learning these history of concordats, which is wild. Because I'm an American. We have separation of church and state. The Christian Reformed Church has no concordat with the American government. None. Zip. Zero. But the Roman Catholic Church had all these concordats. And so it's very interesting how this relationship goes. But it doesn't go so well with Hitler, because the kind of religion that Hitler is really moving is more Nazism, which sort of is a religion on its own. And so Hitler, at least for a while, had to sort of be careful with the churches. But, you have to appreciate the fact that churches had a degree of political power when churches had a degree of popularity. But of course, churches were on different sides of political issues, as they are today. Please don't believe the news that says that Christians can be nicely and easily segmented by the two American political parties. They cannot. It's just not true. Back to the article. Western culture didn't switch out a Christian moral system for an anti-Nazi one without good reason. Christianity's moral authority had been decaying for centuries, and the Church, the Roman Catholic Church, had been losing its power. And when it saw fascism and some dictators, and again, remember, the Catholic Church was used to dealing with monarchs and dictators. They spent most of its life dealing with monarchs and dictators. Constantine imagined himself the 13th apostle. Constantine, I've been listening to this Catholic course on church councils too. It's very interesting because you have first these, we're about to celebrate the anniversary of Nicaea. And Nicaea and many of those early councils are called by the emperors. Now, what is an emperor? It's kind of a tyrant. It really is. You don't elect an emperor. Emperors, like Constantine, seize power with military force and continue to subdue. And so democracies are sort of try to balance strong leaders. And when World War II gets going, the Pope America, surprisingly enough, there was not a papal embassy in America. America didn't have, basically, now, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments section, the Vatican did not have official relations with the United States. Now, there were ways that they were communicating, especially during the war, because as this attempted bargain with fascism was looking worse and worse as the war went on, and because a lot of it was they were deeply anti-communist, and as the communists were sort of overrunning Poland, and it was one thing to have the communists sort of beat up on all the Eastern Orthodox regions, but then as they're invading Catholic Europe, well, the papacy is really upset, and the papacy has been anti-communist for a very long time. And so obviously during the Cold War, then there was a sense of coming together, plus the fact that after the war, the American Catholic Church became such a strong, powerful institution. And in 1960, of course, we elected the first Catholic president of the United States. And that was a big deal. And that's 15 years after the end of the Second World War. And it's 65 years ago from now. So a lot of stuff was moving. So Christians' moral authority had been decaying for centuries, but what made the decline terminal was World War II, the modern age's keenest moral test, and a test the Christian churches failed dismally. And I think that's part of the reason why Catholics get a little bit nervous when they look real closely at Pius XI and Pius XII. And Protestants and Lutherans and Reformed people get a little nervous when they look at how exactly did those churches in Germany respond to Hitler's rise. And of course, if you're in the Christian Reformed Church, if you have family members that hid Jews, whoo! I mean, that gets declared from the rooftops. You have family members that collaborated, but it's a little easier for the Dutch because they sat out the First World War and their neutrality was recognized. Belgium, not so much. The Second World War, they didn't get an option. The Nazis just came in. And so the Dutch, it's easy to hate the Nazis. It's easy to be salty about the Second World War if you're Dutch. And so Dutch resistance, yeah, they hid Jews. And, it doesn't say that some didn't collaborate with the Nazis. Some did, of course. Not just because so many of them openly collaborated with or consented to Nazism, fascism, and nationalism. Nearly as bad was the slowness of the non-collaborating churches to wake up to what was going on. The most glaring sin was the church's ancient complicity in anti-Semitism. But that was only the centerpiece of a wider tableau of moral failings, which the war had mercilessly exposed. Remember what Rusty Reno said to Clavin? The counterculture wasn't so much the baby boomers didn't so much object to the values of their parents. They objected to the hypocrisy. So another article that I've gone to again and again and again. Where is it? How the Civil Rights Movement converted white liberal Protestants to secularism. It's really key because the American mainline, well, they could sort of toot their own horn with respect to some things, and the move had already been underway. In the Roosevelt administration, they had already been opening the doors to Catholic and Jews, and to some degree African Americans and some of the other racial minorities. But it hadn't gotten so far with some of the other racial minorities, but of course, American mainline unofficial state church were WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And remember, the Klan didn't just hate African Americans, they also hated Jews and they also hated Catholics. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the ruling class of America. And as the 20th century develops, FDR is the first one to bring Jews. Did he bring any Catholics in? During his presidency, FDR brought in Jews and Catholics into his cabinet, marking a significant step towards greater diversity in high-level government positions. The most prominent Jewish cabinet member under FDR was Henry Morgenthau, Jr., who served as Secretary of the Treasury from 1934 to 1945. He was a close friend and longtime associate with Roosevelt and played a crucial role in designing and financing the New Deal and the war effort. Morgenthau was the only Jewish cabinet secretary during the Roosevelt administration, and it was a long one. FDR also appointed Catholics to his cabinet. A notable example was James Farley, who served as the Postmaster General from 33 to 40. Farley was a highly influential figure in the Democratic Party, serving simultaneously as the chair of the New York State Democratic Committee and the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He was instrumental in managing Roosevelt's successful gubernatorial and presidential campaigns. Farley was one of the first Irish Catholic politicians to achieve such national success. So, right tab. Where are we? Here we are. So that was already underway. And now, after the war, now it's time to deal with the hypocrisy that the WASPs had with respect to African Americans. And that then would become, I would say, we have the two great awakenings, but there are these other massive religious movements that go through America. One of them certainly the Jesus movement, the counterculture, and another one, the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement has become sacred in American culture. There's no question about it, which is, part of the reason why when I saw this woke stuff starting, it's like, this is going to be a problem, because the civil rights movement was basically about colorblindness, and the woke movement was not about colorblindness. And I thought, if you sort of re-racialize and bring a racial essentialism back into the culture, well, people are going to start seeing race everywhere they go, and that could get ugly. Because once you create holy things, people will use them because they have power. The devil's bargain by which Christianity in Germany and elsewhere consented to Nazi or fascist rule was not some ghastly blunder. It was based on a Christian hierarchy of values. Have you heard that come back into the news lately? Most Christians did not actually approve of cruelty, warmongering, and systematic murder. They simply cared more about maintaining social order and defending Christianity against mockers, profaners, and blasphemers, including Jews, and about reasserting Christian sexual and moral values. So again, if you read about the negotiations between Pius XI and Mussolini, these were the kinds of things that the Catholic Church was interested in, as were many other churches. Even groups like the German Confessing Church, who offered some level of resistance to Nazism, were far more concerned with protecting their own independence and preserving their own moral purity than in opposing the ruler's crimes. A tiny handful of visionaries, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, even just notice he's a visionary. Okay. Why is Bonhoeffer a visionary? Well, because in a sense, he anticipated what was to come, and that would lead to his sainthood in some ways. Such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer perceived the magnitude of what was happening, but even in the Confessing Church, most only argued about the details while being grateful that the Confessing Church But even in the Confessing Church, most only argued about the details while being grateful that the trains ran on time and the communists were kept out. Because again, everyone was worried about the communists, because the communists were just going to destroy the church and destroy Christianity. It was overt. Hitler had to be a little bit more careful. And but again, part of what the Pope Pius XI and Pius XII wrestled with was that they could sort of make a deal with Mussolini, and they had sway with him, but if a priest said something that Hitler didn't like, Hitler was just going to lock him up or kill him. I mean, Hitler just didn't care. And so then suddenly they were trying to have to navigate both of those things. And then, of course, Poland is a Catholic country, France is a Catholic country, and so, I mean, being Pope is a really complex thing. I mean, it's just, it's mind-boggling. As the Confessors' most important leader, Martin Niemöller, later admitted, if it was distasteful that the Gestapo were coming for the socialists, the trade unionists, and the Jews, that was okay, as long as they weren't coming for us. It was a serious, authentic Christian judgment. That's why it was so unforgivable. When the war came, Winston Churchill and plenty of others tried to cast it as a war for Christian civilization. A book I mention often, The Great and Holy War by Philip Jenkin, is really interesting how World War I became a religious crusade. Now, generally speaking, when we read the histories of these wars, not a lot of attention is paid to religion, but there are a lot of religious things going on. So, Winston Churchill and plenty of others tried to cast it as a war of Christian civilization, but the label didn't stick. Franklin Roosevelt found firmer ground with his talk of Judeo-Christian civilization. Ah, well, look at that. Notice how even that term is getting a little shaky right now. It comes from FDR. And of fundamental freedoms to be defended everywhere in the world. So now we have basically Christian imperialism, Christian globalism. By the war's end, the Allies were calling themselves the United Nations, fighting for all of humanity against tyranny, Captain America. They seamlessly bequeathed that name to the organization they founded to police the New World Order, an organization created to speak for all humanity, not for one country or one faith. In the late 1940s, as the Western powers moved from World War to Cold War without missing a beat, it almost seemed as if those universal ideas might be eclipsed and the death camps forgotten, with Christian civilization having acquired a Jewish asterisk. Godless communism was now the enemy, and in 1956, "In God We Trust" became the United States' official motto. Church membership surged in America and even recovered in Europe. Hollywood turned out biblical epics reminiscent of Victorian fashion for fictionalized lives of Christ. The Greatest Story Ever Told ran on ABC radio from 1947 to 1956. Would Jesus make a comeback on YouTube? Would he be chosen as a wonderful topic for us to pay attention to again? The long-planned movie of the same name, which finally appeared in 1965, seemed like a license to print money. Yet its global box office takings of $15 million covered only 3/4 of its production cost. In part, it was just a bad movie. Four ponderous hours, remembered mostly for John Wayne's unintentional comic cameo as the Centurion at Calvary. I have that movie on DVD. I've got to take. I'm gonna look at that movie with new eyes now as the post-war consensus recedes. But the main problem was timing. The producers found themselves on the wrong side of a cultural watershed. In the early 60s had happened, and reverence was no longer the order of the day. There were also too many reasons why the early 60s were just a pivotal cultural moment. The pill, the bomb, the Beatles. But beneath the seismic shift of the 60s lay the delayed shock of World War II, which set off the secularizing tsunami that since swept over the Western world. Crucially, the secularization of the 1960s was not driven by Europe and America's tiny band of campaign atheists. The churches were facing something much more dangerous, a terrible loss of faith in themselves, a loss of faith rooted in the crisis of the war against Hitler. And that, of course, reverberates in America. And you see that playing out again and again and again when we get to the emerging church movement and we have someone like Ryan Bell, who is looking at, has a year of living secular, and he becomes an atheist. You have Rachel Held-Evan, who lives in Monkey Town. I was writing for a blog at that time, and so got a free copy of Rachel's book. I think I'd gotten from Rachel. She had written a blog post about a Reformed church, and I thought, oh, so I started writing to her, and she's like, oh, you're a Reformed minister, and so we wrote back and forth a little bit. But of course, this book is about washing away the sins of the past. And we're going to have to get there to this question of sin. The unwitting avatar of this loss of faith was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the first Christians truly to understand the radical evilness of evil that Nazism represented. This understanding drove him to abandon his church's supine politics and led ultimately to his judicial murder by the Nazis in April 1945. Not for nonviolence, by the way, but for participating in an assassination plot against Adolf Hitler. But now this famous letter from prison shows him groping towards radical conclusions about where the war had left his faith. As he notoriously put it, we are proceeding towards a time of no religion at all. Men as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Boy, does that read as interesting now this far into secularism. Because what happened culturally is they left the church. I mean, the sharp end of the stick for new atheism was using Christian moral arguments against Christian. It was fundamentally part of the baby boom challenge of hypocrisy. The baby boomers who would fight Vietnam, they would align with the civil rights movement, they would align with all the liberationist movements. They said, It's hypocrisy. The new atheists come along later and say, it's unbelievable. But what are you offering? And this, is, of course, is where new atheism began to sort of stumble, because they still basically have the post-war consensus morality, which is built on mainline Christian morality. But you don't need all that religious stuff. So get rid of all that religious stuff, because again, remember, you can't see your own culture. You can't see your own religion. Morality is just obvious. Read Christian Smith's Soul Searching. He did all of this studying of teenagers in America, asking them religious and moral questions. And the consensus that all these teenagers said that morality is just obvious. And the obvious morality they had was this post-war consensus. Once the hypocrisy of the older generation was shown, well, then it was easy.
Naval supercarrier with nuclear engines. Surrounded by dying empires after World War II, the new federal power of the United States devised a strategy to secure global trade and...
Now, what's key here that Walter nicely shows is that America has always been a rebel nation. We're against colonialism because we were colonials. We're against empire. We're a democracy. We're going to bring the values of the Federation throughout the universe.
Project military power worldwide with a fleet of supercarriers. Much the same purpose for which the Federation built its Starfleet. Star Trek's naval themes were emphasized to rescue the movie franchise in Wrath of Khan. The Cold War analogy of Klingons as the Soviet Union was so stark that the sixth movie, The Undiscovered Country, even blew up the Klingon moon in a clear metaphor for the Chernobyl disaster. Star Trek has continued to mirror the power of the United States. The noughties reboots made a series of cack-handed gestures to the war on terror under director J.J. Star Destroyer Abrams. And as America descended into culture wars, Alex Kurtzman's various attempts at Star Trek struck a variety of woke poses to cover a fundamental lack of storytelling chops. Enterprise had been crewed by hard-bitten and probably alcoholic naval men. Discovery seemed to be crewed by the post-grad...
The fathers of the kids watching that original Star Trek for the first time.
...faculty of a liberal arts college. Oh, and when the studio gave up and stopped even pretending this wasn't just chest-thumping pro-American heartland propaganda, as the determinedly atheistic Star Trek crew declared it had faith. But the 1990s, the late seasons of Next Generation, its movies, Generations and First Contact, most of Deep Space Nine's 7 seasons, and some of Voyager, if you can squint hard enough to ignore Neelix. And look, can we just admit that Voyager only struggled through those dull later seasons because certain people were still tuning in for 7 of 9. The 90s remain peak Star Trek. 90s Star Trek was no longer a mission of exploration. Picard's Enterprise is a diplomatic vessel, primarily managing the Federation's diplomatic relationships. Deep Space Nine's mission is quite literally to deal with the fallout of colonization. If Bajor, with its peaceful Vedic religion, is the Hindu culture of the Indian subcontinent, then the Cardassian colonization is the British Raj. In fact, 90s Star Trek constantly contrasted the Federation with the empires that surrounded it. With the Cold War in the rearview mirror, 90s Klingons were retconned as a generic representation of barbarism, plus superb hair. The Ferengi are often cited as a parody of American capitalism. But their mercantilist culture, rules of acquisition, fundamentalist oppression of their females and face makeup that has been called Jew face are more like a broad parody of how Americans saw the Semitic cultures of the Middle East, and really highlight how easy it is for alien races in sci-fi to become unpleasant cultural stereotypes. Are you hearing this, George? Meanwhile,
it was not a lament. Bonhoeffer had become so appalled by the churches and their parody of Christianity. You got some Kierkegaard going back there too. That he believed their demise might be God's will. Maybe, he wondered, a world come of age had outgrown religion. Was Bonhoeffer a new atheist? His hope was that religion is no more than the garment of Christianity, a soiled, tattered garment which was now time to abandon. What was needed was a religionless Christianity, and in many ways, America could provide that, and sort of what the Democratic Party has become for many people who deconstructed out of the church, the babies of the baby boomers. The baby boomers said, the church is full of hypocrisy. And the children grew up hearing that the church was full of hypocrisy. Well, then why do you go? Well, because the liberationist movements, and the kids look and say, but the front line of the liberationist movements isn't in church. The front line of the liberationist movements is in law and politics. So we'll go into law and politics and we'll liberate like crazy. It was the children of a lot of the people that said their parents were hypocrites that would have to go one way or another. Many of them just left. And some of them would come back and say, no, we want religion. Rusty Reno's post-war consensus would in many ways in the CRC displace the overtly clothed religion and confidence of the H.J. Kuyper days. This was the Christian Reformed Church of my grandparents. It was Dutch, but it was slowly Americanizing. And H.J. Kuyper is a vitally important figure in the Christian Reformed Church from the 20s and 30s into the beginning of the 60s. And now my friend Dave Snapper, as part of his THM, read all of his banner editorials. And I can imagine H.J. Kuyper's banner editorials were very, very different from the editorials that would come in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the Kuyvenhoven era. Racism, racism was not a concern. I mean, you have to understand how people were. I'm not trying to excuse it. And I'm all for what the boomers did. And my parents were very much not hypocrites. But the CRC could be a very racist place, as could much of America. There's no question about it. Kuyper's an interesting figure because he was in some ways a modernizer. So he brought the Dutch magazine of the church into the English language. He brought hymns into the church through the Psalter hymnal. He did a lot of these things that were against the generations before him. The Christian Reformed Church splits off from the Reformed Church in America over psalm singing, over lodge memberships, over English language. With Kuyper, he started, so you've got English language banner. Christian education was a big deal. Liturgy and service in English. And really the Christian Reformed Church that my parents' generation grew up in was a church that he molded. And it was modern in that there was a fair amount of conformity. There was a new liturgy. Now, early on, he got synod to pass his liturgy, but there was sort of revolt from the churches and they took it down. But in the end, through his influence of putting together liturgies and hymnals and things, he eventually won, not by sort of sheer synodical power, but by just sort of bringing a new generation on with him. Now, what happens is that many of the people that are older than I am, many of the people that are now in their 70s, 80s, and 90s in the CRC, they rebelled against H.J. Kuyper's version of the Christian Reformed Church. And that change in the culture happened in the church as well. The banner is an interesting feature in this. The banner was the creation of H.J. Kuyper. It was used to propagate and promote what H.J. saw was as what the CRC needed to be in English. H.J. was also instrumental in creating the Psalter hymnal. He was an interesting conservative synthesizer. So this is where, well, we have to keep our confessional and doctrinal purity, but we can change the medium. The medium isn't the message. You can pass your message through any medium. So that would be the thought. So bring in those hymns, but only the good ones, and tinker with some of those unreformed words. And we're going to have our own weekly magazine, but it's going to be promoting our perspectives. Choirs and liturgies needed to keep up, but they needed to be reformed. English needed to be adopted, but as an adaptation, it needed to be tightly controlled. Christian education was fundamental. Christian education, we will teach the children what they are to believe. They are no longer Dutch speakers. They might be hearing some Dutch in the home from their parents or grandparents, but we will educate them in being what they need to be here in America, the Christian Reformed Church, our own little ethnic Benedict option. Back to Bonhoeffer. He was aware that this was a paradox, not a plan. If the old garment was to be flung off, what would replace it? As he said at the end of his fullest letter on this subject, the outward aspect of this religionless Christianity, the form it takes, is something to which I am giving much thought. I shall be writing to you about it soon. This is what he writes in his letters. In his letter, so he's trying to think about a religionless Christianity. We need to make Christianity so ubiquitous but right that it's not even seen. And in some ways, Bonhoeffer gets what he wishes with the new atheists, because they don't see it, but they've got this moral perspective, and they're trying to say, no, this doesn't come from Jesus. This comes from like science and stuff. We cooked up our morality in the lab, or it's just obvious. In his letters, he returned again and again to this question. What might be left after the hierarchies, the forms, the jargon, the wealth, and the power has been stripped away, leaving a Christ-like Christianity that serves the world in weakness from the cross? This is sort of the main line, or what's left of it. The letters are full of these sorts of phrases. I'm thinking over the problem at present. More about this next time, I hope. If he found an answer before the Nazis hanged him, his surviving letters do not record it. His martyr's death was itself a kind of answer, but hardly a practical model for any church. This really fits into the Vatican II narrative that Cale is working. Cale did a conversation with his mother, which is absolutely an amazing watch. And maybe after this video, I'll make a video about that, because I got to get them all in today, because tomorrow I hit the airplane. What he did not expect was that after his death, those inconclusive private wrestlings would be published and read as a manifesto, their authority sealed by his sacrifice. A certain kind of Christian in the 1950s was drawn to Bonhoeffer, and like him, raging from Paul Tillich to John Robinson. These figures presented clarity, urgency, and impatience with the complacent churchiness that in the 1930s had ignored or belittled the moral emergency of fascism until it was too late. In the 1950s, Bonhoeffer's spirit seemed to be embodied in churchmen, such as the English anti-apartheid campaigner Trevor Huddleston, and above all, Martin Luther King Jr. And so when the moment of cultural flux arrived in the early 1960s, some of the most compelling and authoritative Christian voices were advocating not conventional Christian ethics, but radical or indeed secular application of them. For Christians who formed the backbone of the American civil rights movement, it became a point of principle to play down their religious identity and forge broad alliances that paid no heed to faith. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the leading student civil rights organization, was created mostly by Christian students who definitely embraced a secular identity so as to build as broad a coalition as possible. In Britain, the student Christian movement, which had been leading a modest uptick in Christian affiliations in the 1950s, redefined itself in the 1960s by adopting an openness policy. Its new General Secretary, Ambrose Reeves, a veteran of South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle and a proud ally of King, declared that we can best serve the churches by ceasing to be a religious society. The SCM began to define itself not in traditionally religious terms, but in the political causes it supports. And as a result, it must vanish. In 10 years before 1973, it lost 90% of its membership. But it did manage to outlive SNCC, which dissolved in 1970 after growing numbers of radicals decided the Christian-inspired commitment to nonviolence was cowardly rather than principled. And then you have this. When my mother found some, my mother's been going through, she's trying to clean out her house so that when she passes, myself and my sister won't be too belabored by it. But she's digging up all kinds of interesting things, like when my father left Northside Chapel, there are letters from children, from young people in the church begging him not to leave, because they're saying, if you leave, we'll probably get a black pastor in here that preaches black power. There's a real conflict. Of course, many people sort of move towards Stokely Carmichael or Malcolm X because they say King, by the mid to late 60s, by the mid 60s, King was no longer fashionable. It was seen, this nonviolence isn't going anywhere. We need active resistance. And, you see the evolution of these activist movements that, nonviolence doesn't bring the revolution quick enough or clear enough. One of the issues coming to Senate this year are a couple of overtures that want the banner to have a different mandate. Now, this is so interesting because, of course, the banner gets started by H.J. Kuyper, who, between the banner and the liturgy and Christian school, H.J. Kuyper would be like the English language American reformer that would form the Christian Reformed Church. Didn't matter if it was racist, that's what he was going to do. And then, of course, the banner takes a turn when all of these movements come through. Well, the banners got to change. The banners got to reform. And, how do we do this?
Every society has to have a consensus, and that consensus has to be defended and in some cases imposed. And we live under this open society consensus. In the book, I look at what I think is a signal document in the formation of this consensus. It's the Harvard report titled Education for a Free Society. Now, the president of Harvard at the time was James Conant, and Conant was the civilian head of the Manhattan Project. And in 1943, there's the Battle of Stalingrad in summer of 1943. And at that point, he was aware of our technological advantage, which ultimately culminated in the bomb. The realities on the battlefields of Europe were now clear. We were clearly going to win the war. And he formed this committee at Harvard in the fall of 1943 to think about, how do we reconstruct our civilization? So in this report, the faculty members of the report, they wanted to balance the authority of the Western tradition, the canon, the Western canon, but they wanted to open it up to greater freedom for students to ask critical questions. So they were trying to balance, if you will, the authority of our tradition with this new emphasis on openness. But all of the prestige went to openness. And so over time, this erodes the balance. Or you can even think of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s book from 1949 called The Vital Center. And the vital center is his recognition that in a modern technological capitalist society that you have all this dynamism and change, and it needs to be balanced in the vital center. To create a vital center, it needs to be balanced by security and a sense of belonging. And I think that those, like I say, I think I probably would have agreed with that. In fact, I went back and reread The Vital Center recently. It's a marvelous book of political propaganda.
Nah.
He was very good. And it's a smart book. And that balance is a desirable balance. But, you know, I got to college. I was in the last wave of students to do obligatory Western Civ, year-long class, Plato to present, as we called it. And we read the great touchstones of the Western tradition, but our faculty members, they felt they had no right to tell us what to think about those books.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time you get to the 80s, you get the Canon Wars, and you got Jesse Jackson at Stanford University in 1989. Hey ho, Western Civ's got to go. And by the time you get to the 90s, the canon itself has been tossed out. And all you have is the openness, critical questioning side of the equation. And so, you know, and someone like George Soros, you can understand. I mean, he was a refugee from Budapest. I think he grew up in Budapest. So a Jewish refugee, survives the war, comes to England, studies at University of London where Karl Popper was teaching. And Karl Popper had an explanation for what went wrong. And he published in his famous book, Open Society and Its Enemies. And who is the great enemy of an open society in the Open Society and Enemies? Plato. Who is the foundation of a Western philosophical tradition? Plato. And so if you look at anti-Western ideology in the academy today, it is simply an outworking of Popper's own thesis. I mean, it's not a logical outworking. It's more that Popper, like, you have a civilizational crisis, 1914, 1945. You have Popper, who was, you know, from Vienna. He was deeply traumatized by, I think, the rapid fascist takeover of, he fled and wound up, I think, teaching in New Zealand or something during the war, when he wrote the book. And, you know, so he gives his explanation for what went wrong. And he goes deep, right? I mean, the rot's at the very root of our
Plato, yeah.
civilization. And so we have to put things on a fundamentally new footing for him. And Karl Popper didn't want people to be released from prison, and he wasn't on open borders. These are all things that he could probably never. Same-sex marriage, transgender ideology, they're all erasing borders. They're all efforts to make things more open. He could never have imagined those things, but you know, that way of thinking, when it starts to gain momentum, leads us to where we are today, or at least where we were until only recently, because there are forces gathering that are pressing in the other direction.
So, Plato's the great hero, and Plato's the great enemy. And, you know, again, when I look at complaining about the Bible, it's like, no, it's the Greeks that we get ours from. It's like, you know, might sound a little postmodern, and I'm not postmodern with respect to texts, but different communities work with texts in different ways, and they tend to read some things in the light of the others, and they work it through. And so, yeah, Plato's at the beginning of Western civilization in many respects, and Plato's the enemy of Western civilization. But if you want to see an area of dogmatism around us. It's critical thinking. We are going to encourage critical thinking because that's what people need. They need critical thinking. Well, why do they need critical thinking? So the Christian Reformed Church, there's the agenda, and then there's a supplement to the agenda. You can download it free from the internet if you really want to be put to sleep at night. But the Council of Delegates has a right of response to overtures that come in. The Council of Delegates is a body that's every classist delegates someone to this Council of Delegates. Council of Delegates manages things between synods. And so they work on behalf of synod, and they manage things between synods. And these overtures came up with respect to the banner, because the banner has been a source of contention between sort of conservatives and, let's say, the post-war consensus since the baby boomers that has dominated the banner for a while. And I can put up the cover. It's time to burn the wooden shoes, because again, openness. We've got to get rid of, we've got to get rid of the Dutchness here. There are two overtures in Synod 2025 regarding the banner's mandate. Overture 5 from the Council of First Christian Reformed in Artesia, California, and Overture 6 from Classis Heartland. Overture 5 asks for the creation of a committee to require the banner's mandate. The new mandate should foster strict adherence to our confessional documents, rather than debate about them. Well, that would be the banner of H.J. Kuyper. That was not a banner of debate. That was a banner of, this is what to think. That's the banner of that's my grandparents' banner. Overture 6 suggests specific amendments to various sections of the banner's mandate, with the goal of ensuring that the mandate should represent our denomination's official confessional and biblical positions faithfully, and acknowledge any articles which are in fact in conflict with them clearly, so as to avoid the current confusion within and outside our denomination. That overture is concerned that someone will just be Googling something and an article will come up from the banner and they'll read it and they're like, is that what the Christian Reformed Church thinks? I would never want to go to a church that thinks that. In other words, the banner should be monovocal. It should just basically be, in a sense, a propaganda piece. And I don't mean that pejoratively. A confessional piece, a formational piece. This is what we think as the Christian Reformed Church. So say we all. Yuck, yuck, yuck. And I don't mean the yucks pejoratively. Those who watch the channel enough or watch Grim Grizzles know why I almost can't say one without the other now. We want to emphasize at the outset that the banner is and has been committed to be faithful to Scripture and the confessions, while honoring all parts of its mandate and its synodical editorial guidelines. The banner has always strived to serve the denomination as faithfully as we can. Okay. Core issues. 2 different visions of the banner's role and purpose. The core issue is that there are 2 different visions of what the banner is supposed to be and do for the denomination. One vision reflected in Overture 5 especially is that the banner should be a voice of the institution, its primary role to promote Christian Reformed confessional and synodical positions, to disciple and unite members under these positions. Sort of the H.J. Kuyper without the racism and stuff. We can discern this vision in the following excerpt from Article 5. Therefore, the banner should be retooled as a mechanism for discipleship and unity. The second vision is the historical traditional vision of the banner as journalistic media. No, I don't think so. I think if you're looking at what the old banner used to be, now why would the Council of Delegates say its traditional thing is critical thinking, open expression, debate? That's because that's the one they remember. That's the banner that even someone my age, if I started reading the banner in, let's say, high school or college, which I didn't, that would be the banner I would expect to see. Because what does the church need? The church needs critical thinking. The church needs to be the kitchen table of the denomination. I don't think that was the banner of H.J. Kuyper. In fact, pretty darn sure it wasn't. So it's interesting that the word traditional got put in there. A journalistic ministry includes opinion journalism and not merely news reporting. Do you want to know which industry is probably in worse shape than the clergy industry? Journalism. Why? Well, what was journalism in sort of peak post-war consensus? Journalists were supposed to be the prophets. The journalists were supposed to be the truth sayers. The journalists were supposed to point out hypocrisy. And every Sunday morning show you're going to look at, when they bring the politician in, it's all about pointing out the hypocrisy. Look at Jordan Peterson and Kathy Newman. Her job, point out the hypocrisy. Point out the hypocrisy. And then, of course, when people point out the hypocrisy of the news, even someone like a comedian like Jon Stewart, well, the news people don't necessarily like that very much. But journalism? How old is journalism? How traditional is journalism? Again, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, what does that word tradition mean? A journalistic ministry includes opinion journalism and not merely news reporting, and a discipleship dimension, but in dialogical format, dialogos. We have tried to stay true to the spirit of the vision. We believe this vision is Synod's original hope and goal for the magazine. Probably not its original hope. Its original hope as far back as you can remember. But before that, there's actually, and I've been working with a couple of people because I'd really like to see the banner in the Internet Archive, all the old ones. Because I'd be really curious to read some H.J. Kuiper banner editorials. I think they'd be maybe super bad. I get it. WASPy America had to go away. It became an embarrassment. It was hypocrisy. The racism, classism, sexism was all bad. And what's interesting is that I don't really think, contrary to a lot of the drama that we have going on now, I don't really think any of these people are for the return of racism and anti-Semitism. They're not. The post-war consensus won. But then you have to ask the question, okay, well, how do we just keep pouring acid on everything? Where do we stop? How can we sort of find a way to actually do this? It is why the banner is tasked to be a vehicle through which church members can express their views and opinions on pertinent issues, and to permit people of the church to voice their views and reactions, even though some of these views may be unacceptable to others in the church. This is why the editor has editorial freedom to provide a biblical, prophetic, and responsible criticism of ideas, decisions, policies, programs. In other words, it shouldn't just be a propaganda piece. Fair enough. But we're going to have to think through how this works, because the banner is in a much different ecosystem than it was in the 1930s, the 1960s, or the 1980s. It's in a very different ecosystem in terms of many of these things. And there's some really interesting inversions that have happened. Two values war within, like Jacob and Esau. I suspect that the spirit behind the overtures would suggest that Esau has sold his birthright. The tools of liberalism, such as journalism, are needed to keep the church from its own sins. One wants the banner to be the voice of the institution to the church. The other, ironic populists today, suggest it should be the voice of the people. Now, part of the charge against the banner was it didn't give certain people who were conservatives enough voice in it. Now, I think the banner has, under pressure of the last number of years, really tried hard to sort of balance that, but the conservatives want something different from the banner, from what the banner was designed to do after its retooling with the post-war consensus. Those chairs are reversed. The institution was about to look for absolution from the heirs of victims of past crime. That became the institutional liturgy. The people were the upstarts that wanted confessions, declaring that, in fact, the institution is founded upon the confessing of the confessions. The populists have once again now ceased the institution. They are younger. While their parents rebelled against the man born in the age of WASP leadership, they now rebel against the post-war consensus. The H.J. Kuiper CRC would be transformed after the war into the form of the post-war consensus. The humiliation of the church, recognized by the church, would never happen again. Remember that? Never again. Never again could the church be charged with hypocrisy on racism and genocide, because it would charge itself for those crimes first. Maybe people would blame her, but the church would blame herself more loudly and clearly than anyone else. Read the Human Sexuality Report and see Synod 2022 for all the confessing that went on. Again and again, churches and its secular heirs will confess openly and publicly for the sins of the past, the echo of the Third Reich. Never again would we be guilty of this. Or if we were and are, we would confess and confess. We would do the work. We would recognize our privilege. We would again and again self-identify as racists and murderers and plead with the ancestors, or plead with the descendants of our genocides to hold us guiltless before their eyes upon the thrones we have placed them. I remember listening to John McWhorter talk to Glenn Lowry, and he said, it seems that a lot of these white people, all they really want is for some person of color to declare them sinless. Or some person of color to see them do the work and give them that stamp. And that was that whole woke business. And in some ways you can see in the religionless world, there's no longer a God above to declare you sinless, because the church that preached that was full of sin. And so now we must have the proxies below declare us not to be guilty of the sins of our ancestors. It's a crazy thing, but here it is. So it'll be really interesting to hear what you have to say. Leave a comment.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderklay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Pajot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Still I have it. There are moments I conveniently forget that I'm a 40-year-old man. The last vestiges of a ghost long dead. The ghost with the Messiah complex. A Messiah too lazy to rise or ascend. Happily hurt and hard. A hanger-on or haunting of a time past. A heroic dream of the harrowing of hell. Failure to launch. Cling to a life vest. Treading in spells that linger and last. Mom and Dad, righteous and mad, daydreamers with ghosts of their own. My memory of them stoic, looking with aims to pretend. Always on the brink of somewhere. Each a child dancing on the fence. On down the river. Dreamt in the sunshine. Saturday morning cartoons, the only Sabbath I knew. A disciple of Jim Henson and John Hughes. Worship in cathedrals where the Toys R Us. Baptized in ball pits. A clown served the sacrament we eat. More Pepsi and Pizza Hut. Say please. Say cheese. Between Kurt Cobain, a scrambled cable screen, towers tumbling, Super Bowls, and reality TV, the ghost is constitutionally unwilling and intrinsically unable to see and be seen, searching madly for attention to seek. But you could be anything. Never say never. If you've got nothing nice to say, don't say nothing, ever. Don't talk to strangers. See what I say, just do it. You don't listen very well, do you? You don't do very well, do you? You're not looking too good, are you? Keep up. Appearances aren't what they seem. Will you ever grow up? You look like you're stuck. I think you took too much. Echoes the ghost within the host, who prays the dead bury their dead and stay buried.